Yeah, so today we are dealing with an executive summary. So, and what you'll see, it's something that's very simple, but yet it's one of the most critical components, in my opinion, in the EIA reporting. So, who am I? My name is Kuben Sami. I like to think I'm an environmental activist, and mainly because I have got into and continue to get into trouble for speaking the truth and fighting for justice. So that's the label I've attached to my practice, is the activist, environmental activist, and that's my biography. These are some of the services I offer: legal services and consulting services, independent reviewing of EIA reports, appeals in terms of NEMA, in terms of the Water Act, and representing clients at the Water Tribunal. And then I also do legal advice and opinions on matters that are either, during the EIA, people need to know what's the best legal options. And then the other most exciting part of being a legal practitioner is appearing in court and fighting the good fight. Okay, so an executive summary, like I've explained to people, is not a nice to have. It is not something that you just tag on to the EIA report and hope for the best. Let me just admit Jamie in. So yes, it is not a nice to have. And in my opinion, one of the most critical elements of the EIA report. EIA report I'm using as a very generic term. It could be the basic assessment report, it could be a scoping report, or it could be the environmental impact report, or the EIR, as most people refer to it. So it is not a legal requirement. So if you go through the EIA regulations, an appendix to the regulations lays down all the requirements for the contents of the various EIA reports. It will lay down the contents of the scoping report or the basic assessment report, and these are the minimum requirements that these reports have to comply with. But the executive summary is not in there. So it's not a legal requirement. But what is it? It is an international best practice. It is international best practice to include an executive summary in an EIA report. In fact, any report that you're putting out, especially these ones that are being put out into the public and then submitted to the authorities, should have an executive summary. Now, your decision makers, which are the competent authorities, whether they're sitting at the province or the national level, they are the ones that are making the decision. And they are more likely to base their decision purely on your executive summary. Why? Because case officers are the guys that sit in the office that actually review the reports that you compile. And they're the ones that will actually then, based on reading that report, draft if they're going to authorize the development, they're the ones that do the spade work. So these guys have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of work to do. And one way your executive summary makes life easier for them. So in most cases, they are under pressure to issue these decisions or conclude this application, because the timeframes, as you know, are very strict in the EIA regulations. So yeah, they are more likely to read and rely on the contents of an executive summary to make a decision on this EIA application. So that is how important an executive summary is. And it should be able to tell the authorities, this is what the project is about, or this is what the proposed development is about. This is what the potential environmental impacts are, and this is how we intend to remediate the adverse environmental impacts. And this is the recommendation insofar as this application is concerned. And that's what, in essence, your executive summary should be doing. Now, what I've noticed in terms of EIA reporting, just by the way, we had I think it was last month, I had a discussion with various practitioners, and we discussed what, the whole series of problems that we are faced with in terms of the quality of reporting, EIA reporting in South Africa. And there were various sort of issues and solutions as well thrown in. But as far as my experience goes in terms of looking at the EIA reports, just fairly recently, I did work for a client, and it involved reviewing an environmental impact report, and it had no executive summary. So my clients who were basically affected stakeholders, they had the unfortunate duty to read through the entire report to figure out what's going on. So there was no executive summary basically summarizing what actually is going on in this report. So that's one of the most common problems, is that EIA reports, whether it's scoping, basic assessment, or the EIR, there is no attempt to put in an executive summary. Then those that do contain an executive summary, the one problem with those that do have executive summaries in them, those executive summaries tend to be a sort of a general summary, which fails to even highlight any of the key findings of the environmental impact assessment. Then there are some where the information is vague and wishy-washy and contain all this irrelevant information. It's like, in some cases I've read where the guys go on talking about the proponent, the company, and their shareholders, and that's all irrelevant information, especially in an executive summary. And then in most cases, most practitioners tend to confuse an executive summary with an introduction. So what you'll find a heading, a subheading, or a heading entitled executive summary, and what's in there is an introduction to the entire project. And then in the worst case scenario is where the executive summary then wants to tell you everything positive about the development, and like I put it here, obscuring the negative impacts. So the executive summary has to be balanced. It has to be what has come out of the entire process. You can't focus on one aspect just to sort of portray a particular agenda that the developer or you have. So so that seems to be another annoying problem, where the executive summary tends to sing the praises of the proposed development. Then you have summaries that are exceptionally long. Then it fails to be a summary. And then others will have technical, scientific jargon in there, and your stakeholders and the communities are basically lost. They can't understand, and that's not the intention of an executive summary, right? And then others tend to be very bland. And the way it is laid out physically on the in the report, there's no visual materials, whether it's tables or graphs or pictures or whatever. to make the information palatable or understandable to a wide audience. And then the other problem seems to be these summaries tend to be exclusively in English, and failing to take into account the specific area in which this development is taking place and what the community and the stakeholders and the languages that they speak. So executive summaries can and should be translated into the relevant and local language of the target area. So those are the common problems. Now, why is executive summary important? One, it helps to grab the attention of the reader and encourage them to read the rest of the document. And why this is important is that these EIA reports they contain information that affects stakeholders. So whether you are a business, industry, or just a common person living in this community, you are going to be affected either positively and negatively by this project. So it is in your interest to be able to understand what's going on. It is in your interest as the environmental practitioner to make sure that you grab the attention of these readers and encourage them to read. So the other importance of the executive summary is that it provides that summary for those who are unable to read the entire document. So remember, your EIA may be focused on a particular scientific area. You cannot develop an EIA report or draft an EIA report the way you draft a scientific report or a report that you are writing for a journal, like a scientific paper or something like that. It has to be broken down and made palatable to a wide range of stakeholders. It must be made more accessible and understandable. So that's the purpose of an executive summary, is to make the content of your report accessible and understandable, and offer that necessary and important information to the stakeholders without forcing them now to go through the entire. Imagine if your report is 200 pages long. You cannot force stakeholders to read that in. Nobody's going to read the entire 200 pages. At best, they're going to read 5 pages, which is why your executive summary should be as long as that. So it offers the necessary information to the stakeholders. And like I mentioned, the whole issue with language, it should be in the form of a translated summary. So even if your entire 200-page report is in English, at the very least, your executive summaries could be in English, Chinese, Zulu, French, or whatever language that is the spoken language in the target area of your project. So the purpose of an executive summary is to give a very concise description of the main findings and recommendations of an EIA. So it's not meant to summarize every single aspect of the report, but the main findings of your environmental impact assessment. And its focus is on relevant information required for decision making. And I'll chat about that a little later in terms of what are the elements of an executive summary that you should have. It should be kept as short as possible. And you're saying about 5 pages. But if you are dealing with a very highly complex and contentious environmental impact assessment, which requires a lot of depth in the executive summary, then the executive summary could be more than 5 pages. But as you, if you're an environmental assessment practitioner, you are the author, you would need to make a judgment call on that. But what the main factor or principle that you need to have in mind is that the summary must be palatable, understandable, readable, and try and capture the audience without losing them. So if you can draft a 10-page executive summary, but if it still meets those requirements, then good for you. And the executive summary can be used as a background information document. So most practitioners use this background information document to sort of initiate the public participation process. So the best document to do that would be an executive summary that you put out as an information brochure or a background information document during the public participation process. What are the key elements in an executive summary? So firstly, it must tell us what is the proposed development about. And the setting is basically the receiving environment. What is the receiving environment? Is it a rural area, semi-rural, urban, or is it in a highly contentious, biodiversity rich area? So the setting of the environment, the receiving environment, and what is the proposal? The proposal is to develop housing, or the proposal is to set up a nuclear reactor, whatever. Secondly, the terms of reference for the EIA. Why are we doing this EIA? Why is this EIA? Why is this developer doing this EIA? What compels him? What are the legal triggers for the environmental impact assessment? And then you could go, like most of you have raised, was the shortcoming in the exercise, was that what are the listed activities? So the listed activities are the main terms of reference. The reason why they're doing it is because of listed activity under the listing notice 1, 2, or 3, or. So that must be clearly explained or clearly set out in the executive summary. What were the results of the public participation process? Obviously, in a very summarized format. What were the major significant issues raised by this project? A majority of the community that is directly affected by this project are up in arms about the project or are in opposition to the project. That would be a very summarized version of the results of the public participation, in a particular example. What are some of the alternatives considered? Were there alternative processes that were considered? Were there alternative sites that were considered? That summary needs to touch on the alternatives that were, and most importantly, the no-go alternatives. So even if no other alternatives were considered, the project would have had to consider the no-go alternative, because this is used as a baseline to sort of assess the go alternative. And what were the major environmental impacts, and how significant were they? And what were the significant? This is the crux of environmental impact assessment. If an executive summary does not have this in it, then what's the purpose of publishing the report or drafting that report? So this is the most important thing. What would be the potential major environmental impacts? That should be in the executive summary. And then the other important thing, which also speaks to the main reason why we do an EIA, is how is it proposed to mitigate or address some of these adverse impacts which we have highlighted in this report. And then closely associated with that would be the elements that you would now reflect in the summary of your environmental management program. Your environmental management program is obviously the mitigation of, in most cases, mitigation of your sort of subsidiary environmental impacts. And then any other critical matter. So it'll just depend on the type of development and the type of issues that have come out of it. If there's any critical or contentious issue which may have a bearing on the decision, these will have to be elaborated on the in the executive summary. Now, how do you go about writing the executive summary? First and most importantly, so whoever writes it would have to read it. So I say it may be helpful, but it's a requirement. You've got to review the EIA report and you've got to summarize it. And I say here, before you write your own executive summary, it may be helpful to review other summaries and other EIA reports written by other parties. So it gives you, you're more likely to be more thorough reading someone else's report. And then obviously this will give you an idea now of what you need to include in your report. So like I mentioned before, you need to review the entire report and identify the main points, the main issues, the main recommendation. So 1 second. You've got to review this entire report and identify the main points, the main issues, the main recommendations, etc., etc. Now, alternatively, obviously you don't have to do this, but you could get someone else to review your report and even ask them to draft your executive summary. It would be obviously like an arm's length executive summary because this person now is obviously independent, fresh pair of eyes, has looked at the report and drafted the executive summary. You could do that, or you could do it on your own. And then the other important thing is that you got to create a strong closing by clearly and concisely summarizing the environmental impact statement and the conclusions and the recommendations of the EIA. So most of you have highlighted in the exercise that this summary did not even attempt to tell you, I mean, what is the recommendation? We recommend that this report be accepted and that this environmental authorization be authorized. It didn't even mention that, not even at a very simple level. Obviously, if one is going to say that it has to be approved, we would provide some reasoning, even at a executive summary level. Now, some of the other tips in drafting the executive summary, obviously, you need to understand the audience you're writing for. And that obviously, as an environmental assessment practitioner, you would have or should have done some research on the stakeholders that you're dealing with, or in some cases, the receiving environment would be composed of, both the biophysical sort of attributes, environmental attributes, and then the people and the communities and the languages that they speak and the social and economic and political structures that are prevalent in that community. So knowing that is your type of audience, you need to then, in drafting the executive summary, be able to capture this audience. So in other words, your executive summary must be targeted to that audience so that they'll be able to read and understand it. And then the language should be simple. We mentioned that avoid unnecessary technical and legal jargon. I mean, you could put this in the main report, but in the executive summary, there's no need to go into all this and use all this technical jargon. Here, you want to make it as simple as possible so that the stakeholder or the authority that's reading it is be able to capture the essence of the findings of your environmental impact assessment. And then I say the layout must be clean and uncluttered. And what I mean by that is the structure. I mean, you don't put a whole lot of text with no lines, with minimal line spacing and no paragraphs and no even the simple sort of numbering sort of structure that you have, and clutter it. Would somebody else want to even read it if it's structured that way? You know, people love reading something that is structured, placed in maybe text boxes, color-coded, whatever. Exactly, Aubrey mentions headings, subheadings, bullets, bullet points. In some cases, they use these arrows and space, and the structure and the whole feeling of the executive summary should make people want to read it and be able to understand it. And then what I also recommend that practitioners, whether you're a solo practitioner or you're working in a big company or a firm, is to have a set of guidelines or templates on how or what should this executive summary, if each practitioner is going to draft their own executive summary, they should be following a particular guideline or a template for drafting the executive summary. Right, so that's in the very short presentation of what an executive summary should. In fact, this presentation is like an executive summary. It's short, it's concise, and to the point.